You are standing in the heart of a ruined city, the air thick with the acrid stench of smoldering wreckage. The buildings, once towering symbols of civilization, now lay in crumbled heaps, their skeletal remains jutting out like broken bones against the ash-gray sky. A silence hangs over the devastation, not the peaceful stillness of a quiet night, but an eerie absence of life, punctuated only by the distant crackle of fires still eating away at what remains. And there, in the center of it all, a lone figure kneels. Their hands are bound, their face streaked with soot and blood. Their breathing is ragged, but their eyes, those eyes, burn with something beyond fear. A silent plea trembles on their lips, but words fail them. Perhaps they know words won't matter now. Perhaps they understand that the weight of their fate is no longer in their hands. Then, the final moment arrives. A shadow looms over them, cast by the one who holds the power to decide. The executioner, the commander, the conqueror. A single word, a flick of the wrist, a press of the trigger, one action, and it will all be over. The plea for mercy, whispered or screamed, could be met with a cold, unfeeling end. Or something else. Something unexpected. Throughout history, power and mercy have danced a delicate, often violent waltz. Sometimes power crushes those who beg for compassion, grinding their cries into the dirt with the steel-toed boot of conquest. Other times mercy emerges against all odds, an ember of humanity flickering defiantly against the darkness. But there are rare moments, moments so profound, so unexpected, that they redefine the very meaning of power itself. Moments when a plea for mercy is not met with cruelty, nor even with kindness, but with something far greater. A force so overwhelming, so undeniable, that it changes the course of history. Today, we dive into one such moment. A moment where a desperate cry was not ignored, but answered. A moment when the universe seemed to hold its breath, and humanity responded, not with submission, not with sympathy, but with power. But before we unravel this tale, before we uncover what happened next, let's set the stage. Because this is not just a story about one person, one battlefield, or one war. This is the story of civilizations, of choices made in the face of the impossible, of the razor-thin line between survival and annihilation. And right now, you are part of this journey. Every great journey begins with a few brave explorers. Right now, HFY Chronicles-849 is just beginning, and your support means everything. If you enjoy unraveling the mysteries of the universe, if you crave the hidden truths buried beneath the surface of history and legend, then hit subscribe. It's free, and it helps us grow this community together. Because this is more than just a story. It's a question, a challenge, a call to arms. Now, return to that kneeling figure. Feel the weight of the moment, the unspoken judgment, the sheer crushing intensity of uncertainty. What does it mean to show mercy? And when is power the only answer? To understand that, we must go back, far back, into the annals of history, where countless others have faced the same impossible choice, where civilizations have risen and fallen, by the blade of mercy or the fist of power. Let's begin. To understand the weight of a plea for mercy, to grasp the sheer magnitude of what it means to wield power in response, we must step back. We must leave behind the ruins of that city, the kneeling figure, the looming shadow, and travel through the vast corridors of time. Because this moment, the moment where mercy and power collide, is not unique. It has played out again and again throughout history, across civilizations, across wars, across entire galaxies of thought and belief. It is a question as old as humanity itself. When one side is powerless, and the other holds absolute control, what happens next? Let's begin with the oldest records of conquest. More than 5,000 years ago, in the cradle of civilization, ancient Mesopotamia, warfare was brutal, personal, and unrelenting. The kings of Sumer and Akkad, clad in bronze and ruling from mighty ziggurats, led their armies into battle with one goal: total domination. The defeated had no voice, no rights, no hope of appeal. When a city fell, its people were either enslaved or erased. mercy was not an option. To show compassion was to show weakness, and weakness was death. But then, something changed. One of the earliest recorded pleas for mercy came not from a battlefield, but from a tablet of clay, an inscription carved nearly 4,000 years ago. It told the story of King Urukagina of Lagash, who after conquering a rival city, did something unheard of. He spared the lives of its people. He did not destroy them, nor did he enslave them. Instead, he decreed a new law, one that limited the power of rulers over the weak, one that protected the innocent. For the first time in written history, mercy had been wielded as a weapon stronger than war. But was it truly mercy, or was it a different kind of power? Fast forward 1,000 years, and we arrive at the rise of the Assyrian Empire, a war machine unlike anything before it. The Assyrians, with their iron weapons and siege engines, did not believe in mercy. To them, terror was the key to control. They flayed their enemies alive, impaled rebels on massive spikes, and stacked severed heads like trophies at the gates of conquered cities. When a city surrendered, it was given a choice: submit completely, or be erased from history. And yet, even in this era of relentless cruelty, there were moments, rare, fleeting moments, where a single plea for mercy was met not with the blade, but with something else. One such story comes from the siege of Babylon, when the great king Sennacherib, poised to destroy the city, was confronted by an unlikely figure, a priest of Marduk, the god of Babylon. This priest, unarmed and alone, walked into the Assyrian war camp and pleaded for the city's survival. The plea was not for himself, not for power or wealth, but for something greater: the preservation of a people, a culture, a legacy. And here, in one of history's most unexpected moments, a choice was made. Sennacherib, who had wiped entire nations from the earth, hesitated. He did not raze the city. He allowed its people to live. But why? Was it truly mercy? Or was it the recognition that true power is not just in destruction, but in control? That allowing a people to live under his rule was a far greater victory than turning them to dust. History is filled with these moments, these crossroads, where mercy and power blur into something indistinguishable. Julius Caesar, standing before the defeated Vercingetorix, the proud Gallic chieftain who had led a rebellion against Rome, had every reason to kill him on the spot. Instead, he paraded him through the streets of Rome, a living symbol of Rome's dominance, before finally executing him years later. Was this mercy, or was it something more calculated? An understanding that power, when wielded correctly, could extend far beyond the battlefield. And what about Genghis Khan, the man whose armies reshaped the world? His reputation as a brutal conqueror is legendary, but even he knew that power was not just about destruction. When the city of Nishapur surrendered, Khan ordered its people to be spared. But when his son-in-law was killed in a rebellion, he changed his mind and erased the city from existence. A single moment, a single plea ignored, and an entire civilization was lost. So, what do these stories tell us? They tell us that mercy is not just an act of kindness. It is a weapon, a tool, a force that can be as calculated, as ruthless, as effective as any blade or army. The greatest leaders in history have not been those who were blindly merciful, nor those who were needlessly cruel, but those who understood when to show compassion and when to strike. Which brings us back to that kneeling figure, the one in the ruined city, waiting, trembling, hoping for an answer. What will happen next? That is a question that has shaped the fate of empires and the course of human history itself. And in Section 3, we will step even deeper into the heart of this paradox. Because sometimes, mercy is not granted by the powerful, but taken by those who refuse to kneel. Power and mercy, destruction and restraint. We've seen how history teeters on the edge of these choices, how conquerors and rulers have decided the fate of entire civilizations with a single word. But what about those who kneel? What about those who do not hold the sword, but rather feel its cold edge pressed against their skin? What about the moments when mercy is not granted from above, but seized from below? When the powerless, with nothing left to lose, rise to, claim their own survival, because history does not belong only to the victors. Sometimes the defeated refuse to stay defeated. Take, for example, the story of Carthage. For centuries, Rome and Carthage clashed like two great titans, locked in an unforgiving war for dominance over the Mediterranean. Carthage was a city of wealth, of trade, of naval power, an empire that, at its height, rivaled Rome itself. But by the Third Punic War, Carthage was weakened, its armies depleted, its strength waning. And yet, when the Roman legions arrived, at the gates of Carthage, demanding surrender, demanding that the city bow before its conquerors, the Carthaginians refused. They knew what was coming. They knew that mercy was not guaranteed, that their enemy had no reason to spare them. They knew that kneeling might mean enslavement, execution, or worse. But rather than beg for life, rather than offer themselves up to the hands of fate, they chose defiance. For 3 long years, the people of Carthage held out against the might of Rome. Farmers became warriors. Women and children fought in the streets. They turned their own homes into barricades, their markets into battlegrounds. Even as Roman siege, weapons pounded their walls, even as fire consumed their city, they fought on. And when the walls finally fell, when Rome's legions flooded into the city, when the moment of judgment arrived, still, they did not kneel. The battle raged through the streets for days. The Carthaginians fought until their hands were slick with blood, until their blades shattered, until there was nowhere left to run. And when defeat was inevitable, when all was lost, they did not surrender. Instead, thousands of men, women, and children made their way to the Temple of Eshmun, the last stronghold left standing. There, they set the temple ablaze, choosing to perish in the fire, rather than submit to Rome's mercy. A plea for mercy never came, not because Rome refused to grant it, but because the Carthaginians never asked for it. And yet, even in the face of such defiance, Rome did something remarkable. They did not simply erase Carthage from history. They did not exterminate its people entirely. Some were spared, sold into slavery, yes, but allowed to live. Rome, ever pragmatic, understood that absolute destruction was not always the path to true victory. Even after the city was burned to the ground, its land salted so that nothing would grow again, the idea of Carthage, the resilience, the defiance, lived on. But history does not always favor those who resist. Sometimes, mercy is denied, not because the conquered refuse to kneel, but because the conqueror refuses to listen. Consider the fall of Constantinople in 1453. For over 1,000 years, the Byzantine Empire had stood as the last remnant of Rome, its walls unbroken, its culture a bridge between the ancient and modern world. The city had withstood countless sieges. But when the Ottomans, under Sultan Mehmed II, arrived at its gates, the Byzantines knew this would be different. The Ottoman army was massive, over 100,000 strong, equipped with cannons, so large they could shatter stone walls with a single blast. Still, Constantinople held on. For weeks, the city resisted. Byzantine warriors fought with a desperation born from the knowledge that they were all that remained of their empire. And then, on May 29, 1453, the walls fell. The city was lost. The defenders knew it. The people knew it. And so many of them did what had been done so many times before. They pleaded for mercy. Some ran to the great Hagia Sophia, the jewel of the city, seeking refuge in the house of God. They hoped, perhaps foolishly, that even in war, even in the chaos of conquest, there would be a moment of restraint. That the Ottomans would show them the mercy they desperately sought. But there was no mercy. For 3 days, Constantinople burned. Its people were slaughtered in the streets, its churches turned to mosques, its defenders cut down where they stood. The Byzantine Empire, which had once ruled over vast territories, was gone. And yet, even in this ruthless destruction, a curious thing happened. Mehmed II, despite his army's bloodlust, saw the value in what had been conquered. He did not leave the city in ruins. Instead, he rebuilt it. He made it his capital. He transformed it into the beating heart of an empire that would last for centuries. Was this mercy? Or was it power, wielded with a surgeon's precision? Again and again we see this paradox unfold. Those who kneel do not always survive. Those who rise do not always fall. And those who hold power must constantly decide, is it better to destroy or to reshape? Which brings us back, once again, to that single moment. The kneeling figure. The ruins around them. The executioner standing over them, weapon in hand. This is not just a story from history. It is a story from the present, from the future, from every war that has ever been fought and every war that ever will be. It is a question that does not have a single answer, because the answer changes with each passing age, each rising empire, each desperate plea. And yet, there is one undeniable truth. The response to a plea for mercy defines not just the one who begs, but the one who answers. Because sometimes, power is shown not through destruction, but through restraint. And sometimes, restraint is the most terrifying power of all. In Section 4, we will go even deeper. Because what happens when the powerful grant mercy not out of kindness, but as a weapon? What happens when mercy is used to control, to manipulate, to bind? When it is wielded as a chain rather than a gift? Because mercy is not always mercy. Mercy. A word that should evoke relief. A word that, in its purest form, should mean salvation, safety, a second chance. But what if mercy is not granted out of kindness? What if mercy is a weapon, a leash, a means to control, to manipulate, to ensnare? Because power, true power, does not always come from the sword. Sometimes it comes from the hand that spares, not out of compassion, but out of calculation, out of an understanding that to let an enemy live, to grant them mercy, can be far more useful, far more insidious, than wiping them from existence. Let's return to history. We have seen moments when mercy was denied, when empires and warriors chose annihilation over restraint. But now, we must examine the opposite, the moments when mercy was granted, and the price that came with it. Take the story of the Mongol Empire. Under Genghis Khan, the Mongols carved their way across the world with terrifying efficiency, reducing cities to ash, annihilating entire populations. But for all their brutality, they were not indiscriminate in their destruction. When a city surrendered without resistance, when its leaders came forth and begged for mercy before the Mongol hordes, Genghis Khan often spared them. He allowed them to live. He allowed them to continue their rule under his dominion. But this was not kindness. This was not forgiveness. This was a contract, an unspoken agreement of subjugation, a test of loyalty. Because the moment a conquered people accepted Mongol mercy, they were bound by it. They owed their lives to their conquerors. They became vassals, forced to pay tribute, to provide soldiers, to swear absolute fealty. And should they ever betray that mercy, should they ever dare to rise against those who had granted them their survival, the punishment was far worse than if they had resisted in the first place. Take the city of Nishapur. When it first fell to the Mongols, its people were allowed to live. They had surrendered. They had been granted mercy. But when a rebellion stirred, when the people who had once knelt dared to stand again, Genghis Khan did not simply retake the city, he erased it. Every man, woman, and child was executed. The earth itself was salted. Mercy had been a test, and when that test was failed, the punishment was absolute. This is the nature of power. Mercy, in the hands of the powerful, is often not a gift, but a chain, a tool of control. We see this again and again. In ancient Rome, when Julius Caesar defeated the Gallic chieftain Vercingetorix, he did not execute him on the battlefield. No, he granted him mercy, of a sort. He kept him alive. He paraded him through the streets of Rome, a living trophy of Caesar's triumph. And then, years later, when he was no longer useful, he had him strangled in a dark cell beneath the city. Was this mercy, or was it a more insidious kind of power? The ability to decide not just whether a man would live or die, but when his life would be taken. History is filled with these moments. Napoleon Bonaparte, the brilliant tactician, understood this better than most. He knew that to execute a defeated general was to create a martyr, but to spare them, to keep them alive, under his watchful eye, was to wield control over them. He granted mercy not out of benevolence, but out of strategy. Those who lived at his pleasure owed him everything, and those who outlived their usefulness, well, Napoleon was not a man who believed in unnecessary loose ends. And then there is the story of the British Empire. During the 19th century, Britain ruled much of the world not just through military might, but through calculated mercy, rebellions in India, uprisings in Africa. Whenever British rule was challenged, the empire had a choice: annihilate or absorb. And time again, they chose absorption. They granted mercy to defeated leaders, but only if those leaders agreed to become part of the empire's machinery. Take the example of India's last Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar. When the Indian Rebellion of 1857 failed, he was not executed immediately. The British allowed him to live long enough to watch his sons be murdered before his eyes. Then, stripped of power, stripped of dignity, he was sent into exile, dying in obscurity. This was not mercy. This was a message, a demonstration of power far more chilling than a swift execution. Because true power is not just about the ability to destroy. It is about the ability to decide who gets to live, and under what conditions. Now, let's return, once again, to that kneeling figure, the one in the ruined city, the one who has made their plea. The executioner stands above them, weapon in hand, but this time, they do not strike. Instead, they speak. They offer something unexpected. They offer life. But at what cost? Because this is the moment where everything changes. To accept mercy is not always to be saved. Sometimes it is to be owned. Sometimes it is to be turned into a symbol, a tool, a reminder. Sometimes the price of survival is far worse than the certainty of death. And so the kneeling figure has a choice: accept mercy and live as something else. A puppet, a vassal, a ghost of who they once were, or reject mercy and face the unknown. This is the crossroads of power, and in Section 5, we will explore what happens when those who have been spared refuse to remain under the thumb of those who spared them. What happens when the powerless rise, not as victims, but as something far greater. Because history is not just written by the victors. Sometimes it is rewritten by those who were supposed to be erased. A plea for mercy is answered with power, but power does not always mean death. Sometimes power is in the hand that spares. Sometimes it is in the chain that binds. And sometimes, just sometimes, it is in the defiant heart of the one who refuses to be broken. Because there is a truth that empires, conquerors, and rulers have all learned the hard way. Mercy is not always submission. To let someone live is not to own them, and those who are spared do not always remain subjugated. What happens when the powerless rise? What happens when those who were meant to kneel stand once more? Not as servants, not as slaves, but as something far greater? Let us begin with the story of Spartacus, a man who was never supposed to have power, a man who, by all accounts, should have died nameless in the sands of a Roman arena. A Thracian warrior captured by Rome, forced into slavery, condemned to fight and die for the entertainment of the masses. He could have begged for mercy. He could have accepted his fate. But Spartacus did something that would shake the foundations of the greatest empire the world had ever known. He fought back. In the year 73 BCE, he and 70 other gladiators broke free from their captivity, overpowering their guards, seizing weapons, and escaping into the countryside. It was a small act of rebellion, a fleeting moment of defiance, in a world where slaves were meant to be silent, where mercy was granted only in the form of a life lived in chains. Rome did not fear 70 runaway slaves. But then, 70 became 1,000. 1,000 became 10,000. And soon, Spartacus was leading an army of over 100,000 men, former slaves, gladiators, and peasants, all united by one simple truth. They had been shown mercy by Rome, and they would rather die than live under its rule. For 2 years, this army of the forgotten defied the greatest military power of its time. They crushed Roman legions in battle. They raided cities. They carved out a kingdom of their own, proving that those who had been spared were not always powerless. Rome, humiliated, furious, answered with brute force. In 71 BCE, the Roman general Crassus finally cornered Spartacus and his followers. The final battle was brutal. Spartacus, refusing to surrender, fought to the bitter end. His body was never found, but his army was annihilated. And Rome, in a display of merciless power, lined the Appian Way with 6,000 crucified rebels. 6,000 reminders that those who reject mercy will find none in return. But Spartacus was not forgotten. His defiance rippled through history, a whisper that never faded, a reminder that even those who are powerless today may not remain so tomorrow. And he was not the last. Fast forward nearly 2,000 years to the Haitian Revolution. For centuries, the island of Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, was the most profitable colony in the world. Its sugar plantations, worked by African slaves, fueled the wealth of France. The enslaved people had no rights. They were given no voice. When they begged for mercy, they were given the whip. But in 1791, something extraordinary happened. Led by figures like Toussaint Louverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines, the enslaved people of Haiti did what no one thought possible. They rose, they rebelled, and they did not stop until they had overthrown not just their masters, but the very empire that had enslaved them. Napoleon Bonaparte, ruler of France, sent his armies to crush them. He offered terms. He promised clemency if they surrendered. He offered them mercy. They did not take it. Instead, they fought. They endured. And in 1804, after more than a decade of war, Haiti became the first nation in history to be founded by former slaves, an unthinkable defiance of the old order. The world was stunned. The great powers, France, Britain, Spain, had all underestimated the power of those who had been shown no mercy. They had assumed that their chains would remain unbroken. They had assumed wrong, because the truth is, those who are spared are not always grateful. Those who are shown mercy do not always become obedient, and those who rise from the ashes of their own destruction become something more powerful than their oppressors ever imagined. Which brings us back once more to that single moment. The kneeling figure in the ruined city, the executioner above them, the offer of mercy hanging in the air like a knife's edge. They have a choice: to accept mercy and live under the rule of those who spared them, or to reject it and carve their own path, no matter the cost. Because history has shown us something undeniable. Those who beg for mercy today may command power tomorrow. And in Section 6, we will explore what happens when the cycle of mercy and power does not just shape individuals, but entire civilizations. Because power once given is never easily contained, and sometimes the ones who are spared become the ones who decide the fate of the world. Mercy and power, two forces that shape the rise and fall of civilizations. We have seen how those who are spared do not always remain weak. How those who once knelt in submission have, time and time again, risen to command armies, topple empires, and rewrite history. But what happens when mercy and power are not just personal choices? What happens when they become the foundation upon which entire civilizations stand? Because history does not move in straight lines. It is a cycle, one of conquest and resistance, of power granted and power seized. And at the heart of this cycle is one undeniable truth. No civilization rules forever. No empire, no kingdom, no republic, no dynasty. None are immune to time. And more often than not, the moment of downfall begins with a single question: who deserves mercy? Let us return to one of history's greatest empires, Rome. By the 2nd century CE, the Roman Empire was at its height. It stretched from Britain to North Africa, from Spain to the Middle East. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, was in full effect. Roads connected vast territories, trade flourished, culture thrived. But how was this peace maintained? Through power, through conquest, and crucially, through the calculated use of mercy. Rome had a simple policy. Those who resisted were crushed. Those who surrendered were absorbed. A conquered people could keep their customs, their gods, even their local rulers. so long as they bent the knee to Rome, pay your taxes, send your sons to serve in the Roman legions, swear loyalty to the emperor, and you would be spared. At first, this system worked. The Roman machine swallowed entire nations, turning enemies into allies, rebels into citizens. But mercy, when wielded as a tool of control, has a flaw. It does not create loyalty, it creates resentment. For centuries, the people of the empire tolerated Roman rule. But when cracks began to form, when Rome became weak, when corruption spread, when emperors grew decadent, mercy was no longer enough. The conquered, the absorbed, the once subjugated, began to rise. Look at the Visigoths. They were once refugees, fleeing from the Huns. They came to Rome seeking protection, seeking mercy. Rome granted it, but at a price. The Visigoths were forced into servitude, exploited, treated as second-class subjects. They did not forget. In 410 CE, under Alaric the Visigoths did the unthinkable. They sacked Rome, the eternal city, the heart of the empire, the unbreakable bastion of civilization, fell. The people who had once begged for Rome's mercy now stood victorious within its walls. But Rome was not the first empire to fall this way, and it would not be the last. Consider the Ottoman Empire. For over 6 centuries, the Ottomans dominated vast territories, ruling over Christians, Muslims, and Jews alike. They maintained order through a delicate balance, offering protection, demanding loyalty, granting limited autonomy to their subjects. But within their empire, there was one practice that defined their use of mercy and power more than any other: the devshirme system. Every few years, Ottoman officials would travel through their Christian territories, selecting young boys, children from the Balkans, Greece, and Eastern Europe. These boys were taken from their families, converted to Islam, and trained to become elite warriors, the Janissaries. It was a cruel system, a brutal one, but it was also a kind of twisted mercy. Because these boys, stolen from their homes, were not made into slaves. They were given the best education, the best military training. They rose to become generals, governors, even grand viziers, the second most powerful men in the empire. And yet, for all their power, they never forgot where they came from. For centuries, the Janissaries served the empire that had taken them. But in time, they became something more than just soldiers. They became kingmakers. And when the Ottoman rulers grew weak, the Janissaries, once powerless children, became the ones who decided who would sit on the throne. Mercy had created them, and mercy had given them the power to decide the fate of an empire. But mercy is not always given freely. Sometimes, it is taken. Let us now look at a different kind of civilization: the United States of America. A nation founded on revolution, on the rejection of tyranny. A nation that, from its earliest days, preached the ideals of freedom, democracy, and justice. And yet, at its very foundation, there was a contradiction. Because while the United States declared all men to be equal, it built its wealth on the backs of those who were not granted mercy. For centuries, enslaved people toiled under brutal conditions, denied humanity, denied the very freedoms their captors claimed to cherish. They were given no mercy. And yet, in the darkest of times, even in chains they seized it. The Underground Railroad, the rebellions of Nat Turner and Denmark Vesey, the writings of Frederick Douglass, the unbreakable spirit of those who refused to let the shackles of one generation define the next. And then, in 1861, the moment came. The Civil War. The ultimate clash between mercy and power. Between those who sought to maintain a system of subjugation and those who demanded its destruction. And at the heart of it all, Abraham Lincoln. A man who understood that power alone was not enough to save a nation. That to wield mercy wisely was not to offer it indiscriminately, but to know when to use it and when to withhold it. The Emancipation Proclamation. A declaration that changed the course of history. A document that did not simply free the enslaved, but reshaped the very meaning of power itself. Because now, those who had once been denied mercy would not only be free, they would become soldiers, citizens, leaders. And in the end, when the war was won, Lincoln was faced with a question that has haunted every great ruler in history. How do you treat the defeated? Do you grant them mercy? Do you crush them completely? Or do you find a way, however imperfect, to build something new? Lincoln chose reconciliation. But mercy, even when given with the best intentions, does not always guarantee peace. His assassination shattered the fragile balance. His death left a void that was filled by vengeance, by bitterness, by years of struggle that would define the future of a nation. And so, we return once more to that single moment. The kneeling figure, the executioner above them. The offer of mercy. This is not just the story of individuals, it is the story of nations, of empires, of history itself, because mercy does not always lead to peace. Sometimes it plants the seeds of the next great upheaval. Sometimes the spared become the conquerors. Sometimes the defeated rise once more, not as victims, but as the architects of a new world. And in Section 7, we will ask the final, most important question. What happens when mercy is no longer an option? Because there comes a point, in every civilization, in every conflict, in every human heart, when mercy runs out, when the only choice left is what comes next. There comes a moment, one that cannot be undone. A moment when the blade is no longer held back, when the hand that once trembled in hesitation now strikes without remorse. A moment when mercy is no longer an option. But how do we arrive at that moment? How does a plea for mercy transform into a decree of destruction? This is not just a question of history. It is a question of humanity itself. Because for all the stories of mercy granted, of power tempered with restraint, of empires that spared and thrived, there are just as many stories where mercy was exhausted, where those who once forgave found themselves with no choice but to retaliate, where the cycle of violence once begun had no end but the total obliteration of one side or the other. When mercy is denied, when it is twisted, when it is taken for granted, what follows is not just retribution, but annihilation. Let us return to one of the most haunting moments in history: Hiroshima and Nagasaki. For years, World War II had raged. Cities burned, armies clashed. The world had seen suffering beyond imagination, and yet, by 1945, the end was near. Nazi Germany had fallen. Italy had surrendered. Only one great adversary remained: the Empire of Japan. But Japan would not yield. Despite firebombings that reduced entire cities to ashes, despite a war that had already claimed the lives of millions, surrender was not an option. The United States offered terms. They warned of consequences. They called for unconditional surrender. Japan refused. And so, on August 6, 1945, the first atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima. A city of 300,000 wiped out in an instant. 3 days later, Nagasaki suffered the same fate. In mere moments, over 100,000 lives were lost. The world had crossed a threshold. Mercy was no longer on the table. It was not just war. It was a statement, a final, brutal declaration that the limits of patience, the limits of negotiation, had been reached. That power, when wielded without restraint, does not simply conquer. It erases. And yet, even in the face of destruction, mercy found a way back in. Japan surrendered. But instead of complete ruin, instead of the total dismantling of its culture and people, the United States chose reconstruction, chose to rebuild, to guide, to turn a shattered enemy into an ally. Because even after mercy has been denied, even after the point of no return has passed, humanity has a way of rediscovering it. But what happens when it doesn't? What happens when the thirst for vengeance does not fade? When the scars of the past refuse to heal? Look at Carthage, the ancient Phoenician city-state, Rome's greatest rival, a power that once stood as an equal in the Mediterranean world. For over a century, Carthage and Rome clashed. In the First and Second Punic Wars, they fought brutal, devastating battles. And each time, Carthage survived, but Rome never forgot. By the time of the Third Punic War, Carthage was no longer a serious threat. It had been weakened, humbled, reduced to a shadow of its former self. They sent envoys. They offered to negotiate. They pleaded for peace. Rome refused. For 3 years, Rome laid siege to Carthage, and when they finally broke through the city's defenses, they did not stop at victory. They burned Carthage to the ground, They killed or enslaved every last inhabitant. They salted the earth so that nothing could ever grow there again. Rome did not simply defeat Carthage. It erased it. Because sometimes, mercy is no longer an option. But is this our fate? Are we doomed to repeat these cycles forever? Are we destined to stand at the edge of mercy again and again and choose annihilation? Or can we break the pattern? Because mercy is not weakness, and power is not always destruction. Every civilization, every ruler, every individual faces this choice: to crush or to spare, to destroy or to rebuild, to rule with an iron fist or an open hand. And history tells us, those who choose wisely are the ones who endure. So now, I leave the question to you. If you held the power, if the decision was yours to make, what would you choose? Would you grant mercy, or would you answer with power? Because in the end, history is not written by those who beg. It is written by those who decide. And the future? The future is waiting for your answer.